Hello, gastrologists! In the relatively lengthy introduction of this video, I'd like to credit the researchers whose work on child and adolescent psychopathology I'll be summarizing for the rest of the video. I will also leave a credit dedicated to them in the description of the video. I'm crediting Corey H. Allen, Aparna R. Gulapalli, Michaela Milillo, Devin and Ulrich, Samantha and Rodriguez, J. Michael Maurer, Eyal Aharoni, Nathaniel E. Anderson, Carla Harenski, Gina M. Vincent and Kent A. Kiehl. These names come either from the Mind Research Network or from our US Department of Psychology or Psychiatry, as in line with the topic of the paper. Psychopathy scores predict recidivism in high-risk youth. Our 5-year follow-up study was accepted on the 12th of January 2024. Why did I choose this paper? I chose it because, yes, the topic intrigued me, but secondarily because of its recency. I should add that, at the moment, I am only going to be reviewing free online studies. And this is indeed freely available to everyone online. I will consider in the future the purchase of a paper or a subscription to a journal. But returning to the paper I will be summarizing. It walks the fine edge between known and unknown really well in my opinion. Starting from what we already know. We have all learned, for example, from various media about the dangers of psychopaths. Or perhaps we've met one of them, so we actually know who is the subject of this paper. But what many of us don't know, and here I'm talking about the ones of us who aren't versed in the discipline of psychiatry, is the deeper study of psychopathy. We have no deeper sense as to how this disorder functions, even on average. So one can be curious in regard to what the world, the government to be more specific, is doing in order to counteract this not so uncommon disorder. I say this with the power of statistics behind me, since it is estimated that between 1 and 10% of the general population meets the clinical criteria of psychopathy. This same paper also teaches us something about diversity and, let me spoil you a little, how we are more similar than some of us might have previously thought. Yet, the results of this study are to be taken with a grain of salt. Skepticism is a lens through which all statistical research should be viewed from, in a perfectly scientific world. Although in my first video I've put much attention on the theory of probability, I will be skipping various descriptive statistics and some of the details regarding the statistical techniques utilized in the course of this paper. You can read them if you're so inclined, of course. I'll insert the full paper in the description too. I shouldn't understate that my main objective is to educate us both in the reading of scientific papers. A consequence of which is that I'll only touch on whatever I find interesting or necessary to know for an unbiased summary of the paper. Please keep in mind that this is the second scientific paper I ever read, and I was as familiar with the topic at hand as anybody else would be. Getting something wrong can happen to anyone. I hope in that case that the help of domain experts or statisticians may come my way. It's all a learning experience after all. The following paper is a work of jurimetrics, the intersectionary discipline between statistics and law. I will explain and highlight only the abstract. Since the abstract plays a central role in understanding the paper, I will be reading it in full, stopping at every period I deem of significance and adding a comment on further expanding on a newly mentioned concept so as to give you an idea on what we're talking about. I will only highlight the sentence I'm currently on. I will not be linking or citing the papers that this paper cites and links. Ultimately, the will of a paper is to reproduce itself, as is the case with any organism. This is the reason there is a future directions section in this paper. What this means is that after having put one fraction of the effort I did, hopefully you will want to research yourself experiments you're interested about. Starting. Psychopathic traits have been associated with rearrests in adolescents involved in the criminal legal system. If you're wondering what are the psychopathic traits this paper refers to, it's whatever is measured when asking questions such as: has the subject ever physically hurt animals on purpose? Or how long does it take for the subject to get over the death of a particular person in days? Or again, Is the subject satisfied with the way their life is turning out? A value of 0, 1 or 2 is then associated to each question in accordance with the answer given. 0 meaning it does not apply, and 2 meaning it definitely applies. I will attach to this video a link in the description with the popular assessment tool named PCL-YV, which this paper uses for measuring psychopathic traits and that I have just read some individual items of. On another note, it is well known that the US is one of the countries with the highest rearrest rates. Almost 44% of criminals return to prison within the first year out. If the time increases to 5 years, which is also the amount chosen for this study, recidivism increases to 70%. This statistic represents the right conditions for observing a population of second-time offenders. Indeed, this 70% figure is quite important given the percentage of recidivism in the sampled group is near the 75% figure. This shows that recidivism may be present with quite the frequency as early as in adolescence. Thirdly, I will spoil that these studies' results strengthen the already consolidated association between the rearrest in adolescents and their psychopathic traits. Among some additional noteworthy discoveries in the field of adolescent psychopathy are the significant malleability of psychopathic traits in youth, the apparent disruption of the link between institutional and community violence and psychopathy features upon relevant treatment, the plausible inconsistency of the psychopathy designations obtained with different measurement tools, the moderate predictive validity of the structured assessment of violence and risk in youth, or SAVRI, the significant usefulness of psychopathy as a risk factor for future criminality among multi-ethnic offender samples. The positive association between psychopathy and delinquency is likely not to be influenced by type of delinquency. Psychopathy seems to provide meaningful information about the risk for violence into early adulthood of young offenders, even after controlling for conduct disorder, age at first offense, history of violence, and non-violent offending. Youth Level of Service/Case Management Inventory YLS/CMI and Psychopathy Checklist Youth Version PCL-YV might have no significant predictive validity in juvenile reoffending for Hispanics. SAVRI might yield better predictive values than PCL-YV and YLS-CMI, and all these tools have better predictive values for the conduct disorder alone rather than in concomitance with ADHD. There is support for the use of the PCL-YV within indigenous youth in the process of prediction of future rearrest. All of the aforementioned assessment tools are better at predicting recidivism in males than in females. PCL-YV might be unable to differentiate between potentially psychopathic and non-psychopathic antisocial youth. African American youth may obtain significantly higher PCL-YV scores and may have higher rates of violent recidivism than Caucasian youth does, even when controlling for urban status. PCL-YV may predict youth recidivism for females and Aboriginal subgroups, and its predictive accuracy appears to remain similar for younger or older adolescents. The PCL-YV may not be a significant predictor of non-violent or violent recidivism for girls. A gripping amalgam of facts. I attribute a few of these statements countering other ones as a reminder that data varies, and with it their statistics, and so the final results. Nonetheless, there is evidence for the factuality of most of them. Much of the prior work has focused on white samples, short follow-up windows, and relatively low-risk youth. One would expect the abstract, and this goes doubly for its first sentences, to adhere completely to the title of the paper. Well, if that's the case, then why should said issue be addressed in a paper with this title? By extension, why did some of the papers I cited moments ago study the same difference in population subgroups? The answer lies in the broad relevant literature. It's because there are, at the time of the publication of this paper, no certainties regarding the relationship between psychopathic traits and offense outcomes within specific ethnic groups. Then why did I mention the weak associations found in the previous portion of the video? In truth, it's because they were mentioned in this paper's introduction, paired with the fact that they seem to be a good basis for anyone interested in the topic. I'll tell you a possible truth which spawns from the results of a paper cited within this one, coherent to what we've just been talking about. The proportion of white ethnicity within the sampled population may have no significant effect on the relationship between psychopathic traits and offense outcomes. The current study aimed to evaluate the utility of the PCL-YV for predicting general and violent felony recidivism in a large sample of high-risk, predominantly Hispanic/Latino male adolescents with a 5-year follow-up period. Why was PCL-YV put on a pedestal with respect to the other predictors considered? In later to be mentioned predictive models, other predictors have been chosen: the intelligence quotient, IQ, and the history of substance dependence, only to present a couple. I will go into greater depth regarding the statistical variables when summarizing the results section. Note also how PCL-YV, although it is the most used assessment tool for psychopathic traits, it is not the only one. For a couple of examples, look at the Antisocial Process Screening Device APST or the Youth Psychopathic Traits Inventory YPI. In essence, most of those assessment tools are similar in that they measure callous and emotional traits, narcissism, and impulsivity. Callous and emotional, also known as CU, means lack of remorse, poor empathy, and superficial and restricted affect. In case it needed to be stated once again, the PCL-YV was already shown to predict general recidivism. So this study basically checks whether the established relationship holds for a particular subpopulation, the Hispanic/Latino one. The numbers on ISAC-JRP's database confirm that this subpopulation is at high risk for recidivism, as highlighted. Consider that, for this study, 76% of the 254 sampled male youth were of Hispanic/Latino ethnicity. Now you might be wondering, is 254 a sufficiently large sample for the aims of this study? My answer will be partial and double in its nature. The first answer I'll give is that statistics is more of a craftsmanship rather than a science in some aspects. For instance, later on in this study I will speak on the Kaplan-Meier graph. Well, how do we know that the sample is large enough so that the significant differences between groups is not due by chance? I know this my first answer will not be satisfactory, but this is where statistics comes closer to an art form and one has to sense whenever the numbers say what they want them to. For my second answer, I'll simply say that this sample is not far from the average sample size found in papers of similar aim and construction. Chronologically, the first answer comes before the second one, but the two are connected. I would be remiss if I didn't point out that, of course, there are some calculations involved in what I called an art form. You might also be wondering about the follow-up period. How come 5 years was chosen? This paper explicitly states that the 5-year follow-up window was chosen as a midpoint between the year of last release, 2011, and the year of last follow-up collection, 2021. Results indicated higher PCL-YV scores and lower full-scale estimated IQ scores were significantly associated with a shorter time to felony and violent felony rearrest. I am now going to read from the results section the bits I find of particular interest. You may not be interested by it, so you may skip it entirely without any significant loss in information. The two recidivism categories of interest were felony arrest and violent felony arrest. Time to rearrest for each of these categories was visualized with Kaplan-Meier survival curves. I will show them to you so as to give you a clue about the proportionality and the temporal difference. Cox proportional hazard regression was utilized to test the predictive utility of the PCL-YV, IQ, and their interactions. Additional risk factors noted in the literature, such as age at release, number of substance dependencies or SUDs, and traumatic brain injury or TBI, were also examined. All variables of interest were first tested for the bivariate predictive utility for each outcome. These results later informed multivariate models for each type of felony, allowing identification of rearrest-related variables to be covaried in multivariate models in order to establish the predictive utility of psychopathic traits and their interactions with IQ while holding other rearrest-related variables constant. Variables that were not found to be predictive of rearrest in bivariate analyses were not included in further multivariate analyses. This study employs Cronbach's alpha in 2 instances. At this stage, I should mention the limited usefulness of this coefficient. The unrelatedness of Cronbach's alpha to the internal structure of a test was already shown in the statistical literature years ago, according to my research. Regardless, I have found that it is apparently standard for papers to be published to report statistical methods which have been around for longer periods of time. But enough of this alpha digression. For the end of this highlighted sentence, I will be showing you 3 Kaplan-Meier curves. Each of them represents one of the 3 subdivisions of the PCL-YV, and each of the 4 curves represents the low-high combination for IQ and the relevant facet or factor score. This is consistent with the previous findings with the Cox proportional hazard models and with the highlighted part of the abstract, of course. Note that you may find additional descriptive statistics inside the paper. These effects generalize to Hispanic Latino adolescents, a group that faces disproportionate risk of being detained or committed to juvenile correctional facilities in the US. Both the bivariate and the multivariate models just delineated behave in fact very similarly for both felony cases in the Hispanic Latino and in the general population. An important quote from this paper in the discussion section is that this study illustrates the utility and generalizability of the PCL-YV in a high-risk sample. Still in this section, it is interestingly stated that research suggests that adolescents scoring high on the PCL-YV who receive trait-tailored treatment instead of receiving treatment as usual were nearly 3 times less likely to violently reoffend upon release than those who received standard treatment. For even greater context regarding the second part of this statement, I will provide a link to the interesting statistics found on the Latino youth in the juvenile justice system of UNIDOS US. These results suggest that expert-rated measures of psychopathic traits and IQ are reliable predictors of subsequent felony and violent felony rearrest among high-risk male adolescents. It is abundantly obvious the reason why psychopathic traits are reliable predictors of felony. It's nigh tautological. But why is low IQ too? This paper calls the phenomenon of higher intelligence working in inverse of officially reoffending protection, fittingly enough. It evaluates intellectual functioning as either protective against risky decisions or against being caught. Even more intriguing are the emergent properties, meaning personality traits, of someone who is low in IQ and high in psychopathy traits. Research hypothesizes how this combination may bring about a more self-serving and antisocial behavior. Although this study does not completely mirror the aforementioned theory, the relationships between IQ, psychopathy, and antisocial outcomes may be existent but non-linear. Next, in the study limitations and future directions, the researchers shed light on a few things. Namely, that these predictors might say nothing about the rearrest in adolescent girls. Moreover, the data doesn't promote TBI to the status of significant predictor, unlike the literature may suggest. Lastly, the data gathered is based on official records, so nothing can be said with a great degree of certainty about the actual recidivism rate in this population. At the end of this paper's explanation, I'd want to share with you a sentence from the conclusions. There were many things I didn't know to be true before beginning researching on this topic, but this last quote caught my eye in a particular way. It went beyond the numbers and the conjectures, bringing us back into the real world. Mental health professionals conducting assessments for the courts are often required to make recommendations regarding the risk of future offending and especially violent offending, as these decisions can have life-changing implications for adolescents involved in the legal system. You can find the context for this passage at page 13 of the paper on the upper left corner. To me, this perfectly counters anyone who is skeptical about the utility of the field of statistics. It says right there that these calculations, these numbers, can change entire lives. If there was anything to take away from this video, it's that quote, the meaning and the power of statistical analysis. Gaussologists grow strong.